The water came up on its own. That's the part people don't believe, even when you tell them straight. No pump running, no power cord snaking across the yard, no pressure tank hissing in the barn. Just a 4-inch steel casing standing up out of the ground like a fence post, and water climbing it from the inside, quiet and steady and sure of itself. The way water moves when it has been waiting a long time and has finally found its way out. It was 7:14 in the morning on a Thursday, September the 25th, 2003, and the fog was still sitting low over the bottomland east of the barn. The kind of fog that doesn't burn off until nearly 10 in Hardin County, Iowa, in late September. The gravel on CR-D38 was dark with dew. The cottonwood at the field's edge had gone half yellow overnight, the way it does every year, like it's startled by autumn. The cattle were at the fence line, because cattle know things before men do, and they had been standing there since before first light. He was holding a coffee mug, one of the old ones, white with a chip on the handle his wife had always meant to fix, and the coffee had gone cold without him noticing. He was 71 years old. He had been standing at that casing for 22 minutes without moving, and his knees had started their usual complaint, and he hadn't heard a word of it. The sound was what got him first. Before the light was good enough to see clearly, he had heard it, a low, continuous whisper from the casing, like breath, like something exhaling after a long time underground. He had walked out in his barn coat with the coffee and the flashlight, and when he put the beam on the casing, the water was already 6 inches from the top. Then it reached the lip. Then it came over. Not a gush, not a spray. It ran over the rim of that casing the way water runs over a full glass, with a kind of calm indifference to what it meant, what it was proving, how many people it was making into liars. It ran down the outside of the pipe and into the soil, and the soil took it without argument, because the soil around that spot had been dry for a long time too. 50 years of people being wrong was what it sounded like. 50 years of surveys and reports and official declarations and neighbor opinions and county engineers who wouldn't return phone calls. All of it ending here, in the dark before sunrise, with water running over a pipe and a cold cup of coffee, and a man who had lived long enough to see the ground admit what he always believed was down there. He didn't say anything. There was no one to say it to. That's where this story begins, and also where it ends. But the beginning is a long way back. 11 days before that water came over the rim, the rig was already running. The CP750 had been sitting under a tarpaulin in the South Equipment Shed since the spring of 1991, and getting it mobile again had taken 4 days of work he didn't really have. New packing on the bull rope sheave, a valve stem on the left rear that had gone soft, grease fittings that hadn't seen a gun since the Clinton administration. The rig weighed 6,200 pounds and rode on a flatbed that groaned when it moved, and when he finally crawled it down, CR-D38, at 6 miles an hour in the gray light of September the 14th, the machine announced itself to the county like something resurrected, the diesel clatter echoing off the cornfields on both sides of the road, the derrick swaying just slightly on the uneven gravel, the whole apparatus smelling of old iron and older grease. He'd staked the site the night before, 312 feet northwest of the old well casing, right where the limestone shelf dipped and the ground went a little soft in wet years. He'd measured it with a tape and marked it with a length of rebar. The spot looked like nothing. That was the point. He had the rig set up and making whole by 7 in the morning. By 10, the neighbor to the north had driven his truck to the fence line. The man parked there in his green Chevy with the window down and watched for a while without saying anything. He was 68 years old and had farmed that ground his entire life, and he had opinions about things the way most men his age had opinions, held firmly, offered freely and poorly updated in response to evidence. He watched the cable tool rise and drop, that rhythmic pounding that cable tool men know as the slowest and surest sound in the drilling world. His face said he found the whole operation somewhere between foolish and sad. He climbed out of the truck eventually, walked to the fence and rested his forearms on the top wire. "You know DNR called that aquifer dead 16 years ago," he said. "I know. Same ground you're standing on. Different spot." The neighbor looked at the rebar, at the derrick, at the rope of cutting slurry coming up pale gray and wet. He looked at it all the way a man looks at something he has already decided about. "I'll bet you $200, he said, loud enough that the two men who had come to help that morning both turned to listen. "That hole comes up dry." The whole county seemed to lean in when he said it. There were 3 witnesses standing in earshot, and all of them waited. He didn't answer right away. He watched the bit drop. He listened to the tool find its rhythm in the rock. "Write it down if you want," he said finally. "Makes it easier to collect." That morning, August 14th, 2003, a Thursday, he woke before 4 and lay still in the dark for a long time, listening to the house the way you do when a house has been quiet for 4 years and you have learned every sound it makes without her in it. He knew the date before he looked at the calendar. He always knew it. August 14th had a weight to it that no other day on the farm carried, not even the day Ruth died, because her death had only happened once. August 14th had happened 50 times now, returning every year like a creditor who keeps the original note. 50 years to the day since the original well gave its last water. He dressed in the dark, put the coffee on, stood at the kitchen window while it brewed and looked southeast across the bottomland toward the old wellhead, which he couldn't see in the pre-dawn but knew was there, the concrete collar gone mossy, the steel cap he'd bolted down himself in 1987 after the county man signed his paperwork and drove away without looking back. He got his own notebook from the drawer beside the stove, a green-covered composition book, the kind the hardware store in Eldora still stocked. He opened it to a clean page, wrote the date in the top right corner, August 14th, 2003, and beneath it wrote 50 years. Then he sat there with the pen still in his hand, and nothing else came. The other book was on the shelf above the basement stairs. He had not opened it in something close to 20 years. He remembered putting it there after the county hydrologist's visit in June of 1987, sliding it behind the seed catalogs so he wouldn't have to look at it and feel what he felt, which was the particular grief of being told that a thing you inherited is worthless. He got up and took it down. The black cloth ledger was smaller than memory had made it, 96 pages. The cloth was worn at the corners and the binding had cracked along the spine so that it opened easily to somewhere in the middle, the way old books do at the pages that were read the most. The handwriting inside was his grandfather's, small, deliberate, the letters of a man who had not had much schooling, but treated what he had put to paper as worth the effort of permanence. Ink that had gone from black to brown over 70 years. He turned to the beginning, read the first entry, dated March of 1928. Then the second. Then he poured his coffee, sat back down, and kept reading. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to go gray at its edges, the way Iowa sky does in August, reluctantly as if night is not quite finished with what it started. He was still reading when the light came fully up and the coffee went cold. He read the notebook the way you read something that keeps almost making sense, not slowly exactly, but carefully, the way you pick your way across a frozen creek. testing each step before you trust it. The early entries were from the late winter and spring of 1928, when his grandfather had begun walking the farm in a systematic way that no one had asked him to, and no one would have thought to credit. Short paragraphs, compass headings, notes on where the soil changed color at the plow line, where the frost came out of the ground a day earlier than the surrounding field, where standing water after a rain disappeared faster than it should have. There were sketches, rough ones, drawn with the same deliberate hand as the writing, cross-sections of ground, layers labeled in abbreviations he had to work out slowly. CL for clay, LS for limestone, SAT for saturated, arrows indicating direction of movement, the way water moves underground, the way blood moves, following the path of least resistance between harder materials, finding the low places no one above ground can see. Page 47 was the one the book wanted to fall open to. He almost missed the mark itself because he was reading the text first. The handwriting that said, limestone shelf drops here, clay lid, water moving fast beneath, pressure enough to lift. Then he saw the X. His grandfather had drawn it in pencil first, and then gone over it in ink, the way you do when you're certain enough to commit. It was positioned on a rough sketch of the farm's northwest corner, annotated with a distance, 312 feet northwest of the Stone Cap well, and a depth estimate, 214 feet below, give or take the clay thickness, which I cannot know for certain without boring. He sat with that for a moment. 214 feet. And the county hydrologist had declared the aquifer exhausted in 1987 because every bore anyone had put down had stopped at what the surveys called basement granite at around 180 feet, which meant they had all stopped 16 years short of what was under the clay, and every single one of them had stopped in exactly the wrong place, because the clay hardpan looked on a drill log the same way granite looks. If you weren't expecting water below it, you didn't push through it. He closed the notebook, looked at the window. The sky outside was full light now. He found the measuring tape in the second drawer of the workbench, the long one, a 300-footer on a steel reel his father had used for fence lines. He took the flashlight off the nail by the back door and walked out into the morning, which was already warmer than it had any right to be at 6 a.m. in late August. He stood at the old well casing, oriented northwest by the compass on his keychain, and began to count his steps. He counted 312 feet on a bearing of 322 degrees, northwest, just as the notebook said, and stood there in the dry grass at the edge of the cornfield where the limestone shelf had caved sometime in the 1960s and left a low depression he had always assumed was drainage trouble. He had tiled around it twice, put lime on it, cursed it in wet springs and forgot about it in dry ones. The ground under his boots felt no different from any other ground on the farm. Slightly harder, maybe. Slightly less willing. He drove a fence stake into the exact spot and walked back to the barn. The bucket was hanging on the south wall, third peg from the door, where it had always been. He had passed it 10,000 times without asking what it was. He had assumed it was a dip bucket for the old cistern, the kind you lower to check the water line. It was heavy for its size, forged iron, not cast, with the weight of something made by a man who understood that the tool needed to outlast the job. 11 inches across, 14 inches deep. The base was perforated in a tight spiral pattern, 37 holes, each one punched from the inside out, so the metal curled slightly inward, which meant the holes were designed to hold material, not drain it. To capture a column of earth and bring it back up so you could read what was down there. Not a water witch's instrument, a geologist's. He understood it all at once, standing there with the bucket in both hands. His grandfather hadn't been chasing water with a forked willow stick and a feeling. He had been sampling the soil column foot by foot, reading the strata by what came up in the perforations, tracking the clay layers and the limestone seams the way a doctor listens to a chest, not guessing, but listening for something specific. The notebook entries made sense now in a way they hadn't an hour ago. Red till to 40. Blue clay begins 41. Limestone rubble 78 to 91. Blue clay resumes harder 92. Those weren't dowsing records. Those were drill logs written by a man with no drill, only a bucket on a cable and the patience to lower it and raise it and lower it again. In 1931, when 3 neighboring farms went under, and the county agent told anyone who'd listen that there was nothing but dead rock below the surface water table. His grandfather had spent an entire summer proving otherwise. Alone, without credit, without the county's blessing. The bucket was still oiled. He could see the film of it on the iron, dark and faint. Someone had maintained it, and that someone had eventually beaten him without knowing why, out of the same habit that makes a farmer grease a fitting on a machine he hasn't run in years. He carried it outside into the August light. He set the bucket on the workbench and walked out to the barn. The CP750 had been sitting under a canvas tarp since March, when he'd last run it to test the clutch. 6,200 pounds of cable tool rig, 1948 vintage, painted international red once and rusted back to iron twice since then. His father had bought it second-hand from a water well contractor in Ames, who was switching to rotary. That was 1961. The contractor said it was finished. His father paid $400 for it and drove it home on a flatbed borrowed from Earl Mossberger's father. And it had worked every day they'd asked it to work since. He pulled the tarp and found the fuel line first, a hairline crack along the lower run, just where the rubber had gone stiff and dry from sitting. Diesel had wept from it all spring and dried to a black stain on the frame rail. He cut the bad section out with a jackknife, 18 inches of line, and drove the 12 miles into Eldora for a replacement fitting. Hardware store didn't carry it. Farm Supply on the north end of town had one left on a peg that had been there long enough the cardboard tag had yellowed. 47 cents. That was September 11th, a Thursday. He put the new line in that afternoon and tried to turn the engine over. The bull wheel wouldn't move. He climbed around the rig with a pipe wrench and a breaker bar and found the bull wheel bearing had seized. Rust had crept into it during a wet spring, and the race was frozen solid. He heated it with a propane torch, slow and careful, 30 minutes on the bearing housing, then tapped it free with a brass hammer. He packed it with grease from a bucket he'd had since 1987. The same grease, refilled twice. That was the whole of September 12th, a Friday, overcast, and he worked until his hands quit cooperating at 9 in the evening. The tank truck had come again that morning, $340, cash, handed to a driver he didn't know who couldn't look him in the eye while he wrote out the receipt. Since July, he'd spent more on hauled water than he'd spent on fuel in the last 2 years combined. He had enough in the account for maybe 2 more loads. After that, the cattle would begin to suffer visibly, and suffering cattle in Hardin County in September meant decisions he was not willing to make. September 13th, a Saturday, he bled the fuel line at dusk, cracked the injector fittings, worked the crank until the engine caught. Rough, then smoother, then steady. And by the time the yard was full dark, the CP750 was running under its own power for the first time since March. The cable drum turning slow and true, the pitman arm rising and falling like something that had been breathing all along and only needed to be reminded. He was at the site before the sun was fully up, the CP750 idling in the gray pre-dawn, its exhaust rising straight in the still air. The X on the ground, he'd driven a single iron stake there the night before. just a foot of rebar, nothing ceremonial, sat 312 feet northwest of the old well casing, right at the edge where the limestone shelf had caved sometime before his father was born. The notebook had said edge of the shelf, not above it. He'd measured twice with a cloth tape. He trusted the tape. He trusted the page. First light came across the cornfield at 6:41. He set the bit. The first 40 feet were loose till dark and cooperative, and the cable tool ate it without complaint. By 8 o'clock, he was through the till and into the gravel layer, coarse and pale, the kind his grandfather had called traveling gravel in the notebook because it moved when water moved. The baler came up wet from the gravel. Not water, moisture. Enough to darken the sides of the bucket, enough to smell. He noted the depth in the margin of his own small notebook, a spiral bound from the hardware store in Eldora, and kept going. By noon, he was at 140 feet. The gravel gave way to something denser, pale gray, almost waxy, and the cable tool began to slow. By 2 in the afternoon, he was into the clay hardpan, and everything changed. The bit dropped 4 inches, then stopped. He raised it, let it fall. 4 inches. He raised it, let it fall. The rhythm that had been quick and almost musical all morning turned into something else, heavier, more deliberate, like a man driving a post into frozen ground. The CP750 didn't complain. It had been built for this. But the clay didn't yield the way rock yields, clean and splitting. It compacted under the bit and had to be baled in dense gray plugs that came up the size of a fist and smelled of nothing, of absolute geological silence. 4 inches per hour. He had expected this. The notebook had described the clay layer on page 43. Dense blue-gray, resists the jar, will fool any man who hasn't gone through it before. It fooled my father. It is not granite. Go through it. Raymond Cutler had not gone through it. Every driller who had come out to the farm in 50 years had hit this layer, read his instruments and written down what his instruments told him. Basement granite, terminal, non-recoverable. They'd believed their equipment over the ground. That was the difference between them and Clarence. The pitman arm rose and fell, rose and fell. The cable drum turned. The bit hit the clay, and the clay gave up 4 inches, and the afternoon moved like the clay. Slow, compressed, reluctant. And he stood by the rig and watched the depth marks and did not quit. 193 feet by dark. Day 9 was a Monday, September 22nd, 2003. He was at the rig before first light, running on black coffee and the particular stubbornness that sets in when a man is too close to something to stop. 193 feet of hole behind him. 21 feet of clay still ahead, according to the notebook's estimate. He had reread page 43 the night before by lamplight, running his thumb along the penciled numbers until the graphite smeared. The bit went down at 6:15, rose, fell. The same 4 inches per hour, the same gray plugs coming up in the baler, the same geological silence packed into every core. Then, at 11 minutes past 9 in the morning, something changed. The pitman arm dropped and the cable went slack in a way it hadn't gone slack in 9 days. Not the slack of a stuck bit, not the slack of cable stretch. A different kind, sudden and clean, like a door opening in a wall you'd stop believing had a door. He felt it through the frame of the rig before he saw it on the depth gauge, 6 inches in a single stroke. He shut the engine down. The silence after 11 days of that engine was enormous. He stood in it. The limestone shelf had let go exactly where the notebook said it would, exactly where the X on page 47 sat in faded pencil, beneath a hand-drawn cross-section that his grandfather had sketched in 1931 from memory and measurement and whatever it was that moved through the willow fork in his hands. The shelf had been waiting down there in the dark for 72 years, and it had collapsed on a Monday morning in September, like it had an appointment to keep. The casing filled with slurry almost immediately. Gray-blue, dense, different from anything that had come up before. He crouched at the rim of the bore, and the smell hit him. Cold and mineral and pressurized. A smell that had nothing to do with the surface world, nothing to do with soil or root or rain. It was deeper than that. It was the smell of something that had been held under pressure for a very long time. He lowered the iron bucket on its cable. 45 seconds down. He felt it hit, felt the cable go momentarily weightless as the perforated base filled, then hauled it up hand over hand. The core that came up was blue-gray and cold and dense. He set it on the running board of the truck and opened the notebook to page 12, where his grandfather had described his 1931 sample in the same layer. Color of a November sky before snow, cold to the touch even in summer. Smells of iron and deep time. Holds its shape when squeezed. He squeezed it. It held its shape. He set the last casing joint on the afternoon of September the 24th, a Wednesday, with the light coming in low and amber from the southwest, the way it does in late September, when the season is already making its exit. His hands were steady. The thread engaged clean on the first turn, which after 11 days he'd stopped expecting. He pulled the bit at 4:17 in the afternoon. That's the moment the bore is open. Nothing plugging it, nothing guiding anything, just 4 inches of steel tube going down 214 feet through clay and limestone, and blue-gray pressure rock to wherever it ended. He stood at the casing head and listened. Nothing. He walked to the truck, poured coffee from the thermos. It had gone lukewarm sometime around noon, and he'd stopped noticing. He ate half a ham sandwich standing up, then sat on the rig's toolbox and ate the other half. The field was quiet the way fields get in the hour before dark, when the insects have stopped and the birds haven't started their evening round yet, when everything holds its breath for no particular reason. 20 minutes. 30. He watched the casing. Nothing. He opened the notebook to page 47. The X was still there, drawn in pencil that had held its darkness for 72 years. He had drilled that X. He was sitting 12 feet from it. He closed the notebook and set it on his knee. At the 38th minute he heard it. Not water. Not yet. A sound like a breath being drawn back in through clenched teeth. Pressurized air pushing up through the water column below, finding the only exit it had ever been offered. The casing hissed, a single sustained mineral note. Then the lip of the casing began to weep. Not pour, not flow. Weep. Small beads of water forming at the rim and running down the outside of the steel, the way a cold glass sweats in August. He didn't move. Then more. Then the weeping became a seam, and the seam became a trickle, and the trickle became a column, not a spray, not a gush, a column, warm at first from 11 days of friction and compressed earth, then cooling fast as the water behind it pushed forward from wherever it had been waiting, and then cold, genuinely cold. The cold of 200 feet of undisturbed limestone. The cold of water that hadn't seen open air since before anyone living had been born. He sat on the toolbox. The notebook was still on his knee. He looked at it once, then looked back at the column of water running free in the dark over the gravel of CR-D38. And for a long time he didn't say anything at all, because there wasn't anything to say that the water wasn't already saying better. Raymond Cutler arrived at 7:40 in the morning on September the 25th, a Thursday, driving a white Ford Ranger with a cracked passenger side mirror. He had gotten the call the night before from the county extension office, which had gotten it from somebody who had been on CR-D38 and seen the column of water still running free after dark. He stood at the casing for a long time without speaking. The water hadn't stopped. 18 hours of free flow, and the head pressure hadn't dropped. He pulled a folding ruler from his shirt pocket, measured, wrote a number in a small spiral notebook. Then he looked up and said he wanted to see whatever had been used to locate the site. Not the rig. The other thing. The black ledger was handed over without comment. Cutler turned to page 47. He read it standing up, the way a man reads something he isn't sure he believes. He turned back a few pages, then forward again. He closed the ledger, held it for a moment longer than necessary, and handed it back. He didn't say he was wrong. He didn't say much of anything. He got back in the Ranger and sat there with the door open, writing in his own notebook for about 10 minutes. Then he drove away. That was all. The $200 came in a plain white envelope left in the mailbox sometime before noon. No note inside, just $200 in folded bills, counted out even. The man from the farm to the north hadn't come down the road himself. That was fine. The money didn't matter much, and the gesture mattered less. What mattered was that the bet had been settled and nothing more needed to be said between them. The stock tank filled in 8 minutes. He watched his cattle come to it, the way they moved when they smelled good water, that particular unhurried urgency. And he stood at the fence and let the morning run for a while. Here is what he believed, after all of it, that the aquifer was never gone. The water was always there. It had been waiting at 214 feet beneath a clay layer that every survey in 50 years had called something it wasn't. The well that failed wasn't evidence that the ground had given up. It was evidence that no one had looked in the right place yet. A dry hole is not a verdict. It is a question pointed in the wrong direction. He still has the ledger. The well still runs. Whoever wrote those 96 pages by lamplight with a plain ink pen, mapping water through ground he couldn't see, left the one thing that couldn't be replaced and didn't know he was leaving it. Don't throw away the notebook. You may not know yet what it's for.